The history of women's roles in major U.S. military conflicts is a testament to the evolving dynamics of gender, society, and warfare. From the early days of the nation's founding to the contemporary era, women have played critical, though often underrecognized, roles in America's military endeavors. This evolution reflects broader changes in societal attitudes toward gender and equality, as well as shifts in military policy and the nature of warfare itself. In this video, we remember the history of women in the U.S. military throughout the years, and their role in the major conflicts the nation has been involved in ever since the War of Independence. The Revolutionary War. When men joined George Washington's Continental Army, many women joined them. These men's wives, sisters, mothers, and daughters not only helped boost morale, but were also crucial in a number of tasks, including tending to wounds, mending clothes, cooking, and cleaning. The War of Independence was reserved for men, but some women found ways to join them on the front line. One of these women was Margaret Corbin, aka Molly Pitcher, who disguised herself as a man and joined her husband in numerous battles, including the Battle of Fort Washington. Her efforts were later acknowledged, and she retired with a military pension. Another woman who made history in the War of Independence was Deborah Sampson, who also had to disguise the fact that she was a woman. Women's military roles during the Revolutionary War were not limited to support and frontline duties. One Lydia Dara famously supported the war effort, working as a spy on behalf of the Patriots. The Civil War. It's estimated that nearly 20,000 women were, in some way, involved in the Civil War. Most of these women took non-combat support roles, including nursing. It's estimated that in the Union Army alone, around 3,000 women served as nurses. One of these nurses was American Red Cross founder Clara Barton. Barton and other nurses treated wounded soldiers on the battlefield. However, women still weren't allowed to fight alongside men, which again led many to disguise themselves as the opposite sex in order to take part. It's estimated that about 1,000 women disguised themselves as men to fight during the Civil War. The 20th century was a turning point for women in the military. In 1917, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps' ANC only had 403 nurses. A year later, over 3,000 American nurses were deployed to British-operated hospitals in France, where they treated Allied troops and civilians alike. World War I was the first conflict where women were officially allowed to serve in the U.S. military. It's estimated that around 12,000 women served in the Navy at the time. The rank of yeoman or yeomanettes were responsible for duties such as telephone and radio operators, bookkeeping, and other clerical roles. In addition to the Navy, the U.S. Army Signal Corps also enlisted women to work as telephone and switchboard operators. These women, known as Hello Girls, mostly worked close to the front lines in France. World War II. Unlike previous conflicts, during World War II, all branches of the United States military enlisted women. The Army, for instance, formed the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which later became the Women's Army Corps. The Army also formed the Army's Women Air Force Service. Pilots. In the Navy, the yeomen were replaced by the women accepted for volunteer emergency service waves, and the Marines enlisted women in the Marine Corps' Women's Reserve. Women could also enlist in the Coast Guard's newly formed Women's Reserve. The acronym stood for the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, Latin for always ready. It's estimated that a total of 350,000 American women served during World War II. While they held non-combat roles, these evolved comparatively to previous conflicts. Now women were driving vehicles, repairing airplanes, working in labs and cryptology, and even training troops. Nurses, of course, played a crucial role during the war. It's estimated that around 57,000 served in the Army Nurse Corps and 11,000 in the Navy Nurse Corps. Many of these women worked on the front line. This was the case of Colonel Ruby Bradley, who was a prisoner of war for 37 months. But Colonel Ruby Bradley was not alone. It's estimated that 88 women in total were taken as POWs, and that, in total, 432 women were killed in the line of service during the conflict. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act. The law officially allowed women to serve as permanent members of all branches of the U.S. Armed Forces. The new act was, however, not a free pass to equality in the military. The number of women who could serve on each branch was limited to 2%. The number who could become officers was even more limited, and they'd be automatically discharged if they became pregnant. Women still weren't allowed to serve in combat positions. Discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin is abolished. 1 month after the Women's Armed Services Integration Act was passed, President Truman issued the Integration of the Armed Forces Executive Order 9981, which allowed for black women to serve equally in all branches of the armed services. The Korean War. From 1950 to 1953, a total of 120,000 women served in the Korean War. In addition to the traditional roles, women also served in a number of new positions, including as scientists, engineers, and military police officers. Thousands of nurses worked in mobile Army surgical hospitals, MASH, placed in combat zones. The Vietnam War. Approximately 11,000 American women were stationed in Vietnam. During the conflict, 90% of whom were nurses. Women took on new roles, including those of air traffic controllers and intelligence officers. In 1972, for the first time, women could be promoted to general and flag ranks, as well as command units that included men. After the war ended, the Pentagon announced that both married and unmarried pregnant women were allowed to remain in the military forces. The Gulf War. During the Gulf War, more than 40,000 women were deployed. In 1994, 3 years after the end of the conflict, President Bill Clinton rescinded the risk rule, which allowed women to serve in all positions in the military, with the exception of direct ground combat roles. Restrictions are lifted. In 2013, then Defense Secretary Leon Panetta announced that female service members would be allowed to serve in direct ground combat roles. This was implemented in 2015. At the time, the war in Afghanistan was ongoing. Over the following years, about 100 women have graduated from the Army's Ranger School, though there has yet to be a female Navy SEAL. Since the 9/11 attacks, more than 300,000 women have served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, 9,000 of whom have earned combat action badges. New combat roles. While the military has been slow to send women into combat on the front lines, they have increasingly engaged in other combat roles, such as aviators and sailors. Women keep fighting for America. According to the U.S. Defense Department's latest demographics profile of the military community, women make up 17.5% of the active duty force and 21.6% of the selected reserve. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more.